and thank you for joining us today for MIOSHA's webinar on the Hazard Communication Standard. I'm Brian Roulier, an Industrial Hygiene Manager with MIOSHA's Consultation, Education, and Training Division. We will have our moderator providing resources for questions you may have, and our contact information will be available at the end of this webinar for any remaining questions. This training will address MIOSHA's Parts 42, 92, and 430, which collectively make up the Hazard Communication Standard. The standard applies to countless employers throughout the state, and in addition, the Hazard Communication Standard is consistently in MIOSHA's top 10 most frequently violated standards. The Hazard Communication Program plays a vital role in employee health and safety by ensuring that employers, end users, and potentially emergency responders are provided critical information on the hazards and proper protective measures for chemicals in their workplace. This webinar will address the scope of the Hazard Communication Standard, the most recent updates to the standard, requirements for a workplace hazard communication program, and important considerations for those tasked with implementing the program. Available resources to assist in the development, implementation, and improvement of your hazard communication program will be shared at the end of today's video. Today's webinar is intended for end users of chemicals and not those responsible for manufacturing, importing, distributing, or classifying the chemicals. The purpose of the Hazard Communication Standard is to facilitate a uniform method for classifying the hazards of chemicals and provide that information to the end user to ensure worker safety. The Hazard Communication Standard uses the Globally Harmonized System, GHS, to develop a uniform framework for the classification of chemicals and development of labels and safety data sheet which convey chemical hazards. The GHS system is an international system used by more than 80 countries and creates a common approach among training partners. The recent updates improve the amount and quality of information available to the end users. The Hazard Communication Standard applies to any employer with chemicals known to be in the workplace, which employees may be exposed to during normal use or in the event of emergencies. All chemicals are required to be evaluated by the manufacturer. When we begin talking about end users, the focus shifts to those chemicals with hazards associated with them. Requirements in the standard apply to chemical manufacturers, importers, distributors, and employers who use hazardous chemicals at their site. The standard applies to general industry, construction, and agricultural activities, and since MIOSHA is a state plan, coverage applies to both private and public sector employees. Hazardous chemicals are any chemical which is classified as a physical hazard, health hazard, simple asphyxiant, combustible dust, pyrophoric gas, or a hazard that cannot otherwise be classified. The chemical manufacturer or importer is responsible for determining if a chemical meets one or more of these hazard classifications. The health hazards chemicals must be evaluated for are listed below, along with applicable categories. The severity of hazards decreases as you move from left to right on the chart, with one indicating a more severe hazard. The hazards include acute toxicity, which is serious, potentially life-threatening adverse health effects which may occur after single or short-term exposure, skin corrosion or serious eye damage, skin or eye irritation, respiratory sensitization, which refers to the hypersensitivity of the airways occurring after inhaling a chemical, and skin sensitization, which refers to developing an allergic response after coming into contact with a chemical. After sensitization, health effects may occur even when exposed to lower levels of the same chemical. Germ cell mutation refers to gene mutations which may be passed to children. Carcinogenicity is the ability to induce or increase the occurrence of cancer after exposure. Reproductive toxicity is adverse health effects on sexual function and fertility in adults, and developmental toxicity to offsprings. Specific target organ effects. This classification is broken down to assess if the effects occur after a single exposure or after repeated exposures. Aspiration is the entry of a liquid or a solid directly or indirectly after vomiting into the trachea or lower respiratory system. Aspiration hazards cause severe acute effects such as chemical pneumonia, lung damage, or possibly death. And simple asphyxiants, which means a substance or mixture that displaces oxygen in the atmosphere and can cause oxygen deprivation. The physical hazards chemicals must be evaluated for are below, along with applicable categories. The severity again decreases as you move left to right on the chart, with one indicating a higher severity. The hazards include explosives, flammables that are gases, liquids, or solids, aerosols, which are non-refillable vessels containing a gas that's compressed, liquefied, or dissolved under pressure. These will have a device to release the contents of a vessel as a gas, liquid, foam, paste, or a powder. Oxidizers, which are chemicals that provide oxygen and can cause or contribute to the combustion of other materials more so than air does. Self-reactives, which are unstable chemicals which may undergo strong heat-releasing decomposition even without oxygen. Pyrophoric liquids and solids, which are chemicals which may ignite within 5 minutes of coming into contact with the air. Self-heating chemicals are those which are able to react with air to produce heat. These chemicals will only ignite when in large amounts or after long periods, such as hours or days after exposure to air. Organic peroxides. These are certain types of chemicals with an oxygen-to-oxygen bond. The chemicals can be unstable and present explosive, corrosive, toxic, or extreme fire hazards. Chemicals which are corrosive to metal, and gases under pressure, which are gases that are pressurized, liquefied, or dissolved inside of a container. These may include products like compressed oxygen, liquefied propane gas, or acetylene cylinders. Chemicals in contact with water, which emit flammable gases, and desensitized explosives, which are explosive chemicals that which have been rendered less sensitive to heat, shock, impact, or friction by the addition of an agent to stabilize them. Chemicals which may be covered by the standard include more commonly thought of items such as corrosive cleaning solvents, flammable paints, oils, lubricants, and other greases. However, products such as bricks, metal ingots, or welding rods are also considered hazardous chemicals, since during expected use, hazards may be created when they are cut, grinded, melted, or otherwise processed. Wood products may also be included based on the ability for dust to cause respiratory irritation or sensitization, and treated lumber may contain harmful chemicals such as hexavalent chromium or arsenic, as shown by the photo in the lower right-hand corner. More examples of covered chemicals may include simple asphyxiants, such as gases like nitrogen, argon, or carbon dioxide. These may be used for industrial applications like welding, laser operation, growing, food processing, and heat treating. Batteries can expose employees to corrosives, flammables, or other hazards when they're being serviced or recycled. In the healthcare industry, drugs which may create a hazard for the user are covered when they are not in their solid final form. Covered drugs may be in forms such as solids which are crushed prior to being administered, powders which are dissolved, or liquids which can accidentally be absorbed, ingested, or injected. Consumer products may also be covered if they are used in a quantity or frequency more than a normal household consumer, or in a manner outside of their intended use. These are just a few examples of the multitude of industries, chemicals, and employee exposures that are covered under MIOSHA's Hazard Communication Standard. If you are unsure of a chemical in your workplace, reach out to the person responsible for the facility's hazard communication program, MIOSHA's CET division, or the manufacturer directly. Two types of workplaces have partial exemptions from the standard. These workplaces are laboratories and workplaces where only sealed containers of chemicals are handled, for example, warehousing. The scope outlines which requirements of the standard apply in these workplaces. Work in laboratories is also covered in Part 431, Hazardous Work in Laboratories. The standard also exempts some chemicals from the labeling requirements, which include pesticides under the FIFRA, which is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, toxic chemicals or substances labeled under TSCA, which is the Toxic Substance Control Act, food and food additives, drugs, cosmetics, or medical devices labeled under the FDA or USDA, alcohol labeled under the Federal Alcohol Administration Act or ATF requirements, and consumer products labeled under the Consumer Product Safety Act. Items which are not subject to any of the requirements of the Hazard Communication Standard include hazardous waste regulated by EPA under RCRA or CERCLA, tobacco and tobacco products, wood which is not processed and whose only hazard is combustion. Reminder, wood which is processed or has been treated is not exempt from the standard. Articles. Articles are manufactured items that are not fluids or particles. They also are intentionally shaped during manufacturing, have an end use that depends on that shape and design, and do not release chemicals in more than a minute or trace amounts under normal conditions. The manufacturer is responsible for evaluating if it can reasonably expect that these products may be processed, such as melted, cut, formed, or otherwise, by end users, and if this may create any hazards. The photo shows a used oil container. If this waste is covered by RCRA, then the waste is not subject to the full hazard communication standard. However, employees should still be aware of any hazards and the handling procedures for wastes. Additionally, on the funnel on top is an example of an article, as it was intentionally designed to that shape. Its use and function depends on its design, and it is not expected to release any hazardous chemicals in amounts which may be harmful. It is also not designed to be further processed. Other exemptions from the standard include food, alcohol, cosmetics, and drugs sold in retail establishments or for personal use. Drugs which are in their solid final form administered directly to patients. Ionizing and non-ionizing radiation, such as X-rays or laser radiation. Biological hazards. Biological and radiation hazards may be covered under MIOSHA standards, including Part 554, bloodborne infectious diseases, Part 381, ionizing radiation, and Part 382, non-ionizing radiation. Consumer products, such as those purchased at retail stores, are only exempt from the standard when they are used for their intended purpose and for the same duration and frequency of a typical household consumer. If employees use a consumer product for a use not intended by the manufacturer, for example, the use of nonstick food spray for lubrication of industrial parts, or in durations and frequency greater than a normal consumer, for example, housekeeping staff using cleaning solutions continuously, the chemical is not exempt. The following slides will address the sections of the Hazard Communication Standards, which will be updated this year. 8 definitions were added and 3 definitions were revised to provide additional clarity and align with the 7th revision of the GHS system. Some of the new definitions include bulk shipment, which means any hazardous chemical transported where the mode of transportation comprises the immediate container, for example, tanker trucks or rail cars. Combustible dust means finely divided solid particulates that pose a flash fire hazard or explosion hazard when dispersed into the air. And released for shipment means a chemical that has been packaged and labeled in the manner in which it will be distributed or sold. The requirement for chemical manufacturers and importers to evaluate chemicals in paragraph D was updated to clarify which hazards must be evaluated and communicated. This now includes intrinsic properties of the chemical, such as changes in the physical form and chemical reaction products from known or reasonably anticipated uses and applications downstream. For example, the pulverization of refractory brick, a reasonably anticipated downstream use of the product, can result in employee exposure to respirable crystalline silica. Another example includes two-part foams, which are designed to undergo a chemical reaction. Hazards from these reactions must be included in the safety data sheet. There has been an addition of 2 new hazard classifications, which are chemicals under pressure and desensitized explosives. The flammable gas and aerosol classifications have also had new categories added. Hazards identified due to chemical reactions do not need to be addressed on the shipped container label. However, they still must appear on the safety data sheet. Another change requires that the shipped containers must have a United States address and telephone number for the manufacturer or responsible party. The responsible party is someone who can provide additional information on the hazardous chemical and appropriate emergency procedures. The labeling requirements for bulk shipments have also been clarified. Bulk shipments must have the label conveyed in one of 3 ways. The bulk shipment container is labeled itself, the label is provided with the shipping papers, or lastly, the label is electronically transmitted from the provider in print, electronically transmitted to the end receiver user and provided in print form immediately upon receiving the shipment. The end user must opt in or agree to receive these electronically, and if they do not, the label must be provided in one of the other 2 ways specified. Where manufacturers identify a hazard not previously known, which affects the shipped container label, they are not required to relabel any containers considered as released for shipment. However, if they do not, they must provide an updated label to the receiver for each chemical. and end users must apply the new labels prior to introducing these chemicals into the workplace. The labeling requirement for small and very small containers, those with the capacity less than 100 milliliters and 3 milliliters, have also been updated in this revision. These updates apply to containers where the manufacturer determines that a pull-out or fold-out label are infeasible due to size. For containers with a capacity of less than 100 milliliters, the label must identify the product identifier, pictograms, signal word, chemical manufacturer phone number, and a statement that the full label is provided on the container's outside packaging. For containers with a capacity of less than 3 milliliters, where any label is infeasible, at minimum must be the product identifier on the container. The outer package, which holds the small containers, must contain all the required label elements of a shipped container and a statement that small containers must be stored in the outer packaging when not in use. As with all labels, the outer packaging labeling must not be removed or damaged. The trade secret requirements were revised to prescribe specific ranges which must now appear on the identity of the concentration of a trade secret substance on the safety data sheet. The range used on the safety data sheet shall be the narrowest range of the listed concentrations. For example, if the range is 15 to 25%, the manufacturer shall select 10 to 30% to appear on the SDS instead of the broader 15 to 40%. The revision also clarifies the exact concentration or concentration range must be immediately provided to healthcare professionals in emergency situations and provided to health and safety or medical requesters in non-emergency situations where the requesters provide the required documentation to show such information is necessary. If ranges overlap, the safety data sheet developer may combine two ranges. For example, the range in the bottom left example would either be 0.1 to 1% or 0.1 to 1.5%, depending on the range in the mixture. Appendix A, which addresses health hazards, was updated with the skin and eye damage chapters and includes additional non-animal test methods to promote alternative methods that do not involve animals. Appendix B is the section of the standard which lays out the classification criteria for physical hazards. This section updated some of the classifications and hazard categories. For flammable gases, the categories have been updated to include two subcategories for Category 1 flammable gases. Category 1A flammable gases will include extremely flammable gases, pyrophoric gases, and chemically unstable gases. Category 1B will include flammable gases which are not pyrophoric or chemically unstable and have specified properties differentiating them from 1A flammable gases. Appendix B also added the desensitized explosive hazard classification. Desensitized explosives are solid or liquid explosive chemicals to which a stabilizer or desensitizer has been added. These chemicals pose explosive equivalent hazards in the workplace when the stabilizer is removed or inadvertently lost, either as part of the normal work process or when the chemical is stored. Another hazard classification change in this section relates to renaming the flammable aerosols classification to just aerosols and including a third hazard category for non-flammable aerosols. A new hazard classification, chemicals under pressure, has been added with three categories depending on the flammable component percentage and heat of combustion. Appendix C, which outlines label element requirements, has been updated as well. The flame pictogram now also indicates desensitized explosives. The flame is used because these chemicals are desensitized, so the hazard of flammability is greater than that of an explosion. The exclamation mark may now be used for hazards not otherwise classified. The exclamation mark is not required to appear where there's hazards that are not otherwise classified, but it still must appear on the safety data sheet. We'll now discuss the requirements for workplace hazard communication programs. The lack of development or implementation of a hazard communication program was the most cited rule by MIOSHA in 2024 and continually appears in the top 10. The core elements of the hazard communication program required by the standard have not changed. However, the updates made in the standard may affect some elements of your program, such as labeling and communicating the information regarding the new hazard classes and pictogram meanings. Below is a list of each section of MIOSHA's hazard communication standard. So far, the purpose and scope of the standard have been discussed. We'll now move into focus on the paragraphs E, the written programs, F, labeling, G, safety data sheets, H, employee training, and I, trade secrets. Paragraph D and the appendices focus heavily on requirements for chemical manufacturers and importers, covering the hazard classification requirements, criteria for classification, development of shipped labels and safety data sheets, trade secret definitions, and classifications for carcinogens. These will not be discussed in this webinar. The photo on the left provides a roadmap to help developing an effective hazard communication program for your workplace. Step 1 involves understanding the requirements of the Hazard Communication Standard and how they apply to your workplace, then assigning responsibilities for those aspects. Next involves developing a written program, which provides information on how the required elements of the standard will be implemented and creating a list of hazardous chemicals present in your workplace. The next two phases involve reviewing your containers to ensure that each is labeled correctly and in line with your written program, and ensuring that a safety data sheet is maintained and readily available for each worker. Once you have established your program and the necessary elements, it is critical to provide effective information and training to employees who will work with these chemicals about the hazard communication program, hazards in their work area, and measures they can take to protect themselves. As with all programs, procedures for evaluating if the program is being properly implemented and is up to date should be established and followed. The written hazard communication program outlines the responsibilities and implementation of the HazCom program at a facility. An example of MIOSHA's available sample program is seen here on the right. The first requirement of the hazard communication program is the development and implementation of a written program which addresses how the requirements for labeling, safety data sheets, and employee training will be accomplished. The program must also include methods used to inform employees of hazardous non-routine tasks, such as those involving new or infrequently used chemicals, and the system used to identify pipes containing hazardous chemicals, for example, compressed air, nitrogen, acetylene, and others. Finally, an inventory list of hazardous chemicals used at the facility must be developed. At minimum, this inventory will identify the chemical using its product identifier found on the label and safety data sheet. In the event of a multi-employer worksite, such as when a contractor visits your facility or you visit another facility, the programs must identify how information relating to precautionary measures, labeling, and safety data sheet access will be shared with other employers. Written hazard communication programs must be site-specific. Chemicals, job functions, and procedures may vary between sites, and it is important to ensure that these written programs accurately reflect procedures and responsibilities so that the program can be implemented correctly, and in the event of questions or emergencies, accurate assistance can be provided promptly. Written programs must also be available to employees and their representatives upon request. In any workplace that handles hazardous chemicals, clear and effective hazard communication labeling is essential to ensure employee safety. Hazard communication labeling provides critical information about the contents of containers, the risks they pose, and how to properly handle them. This labeling system, standardized under the Hazard Communication Standard, helps workers quickly identify potential dangers and appropriate actions. Containers which are sent from the manufacturer or distributor to another facility are considered shipped containers. Shipped containers require specific information to be on the label, which is affixed to the chemical container. These labels must remain on the container during shipping and while being stored or used at their end destination. These labels shall not be removed or defaced and must remain legible. These labels must have 6 required elements: the product identifier, the signal word, the hazard statements, pictograms, precautionary statements, and the name and responsible party and the US-based address and telephone number. These elements all remain similar to the previous requirements for shipped labels, with the specification the responsible party must have a US-based address and phone number listed. The GHS shipped container labels are not the same as Department of Transportation labels and placards. One of 2 signal words will appear on the shipped container label. These words are either danger, which indicates a more severe hazard, or warning, which indicates a less severe hazard. Only one of these words will appear. Which signal word appears is based on the hazard classification done by the manufacturer and specific guidance from Appendix C of the standard. The hazard statements on the label provide a description of the hazards based on the manufacturer's classification and categorization of the chemical. The hazard statements are uniform for each specific classification and category. For example, a chemical classified as a Category 1 flammable liquid must contain the statement, extremely flammable liquid and vapor. Hazard statements for each hazard identified, except those from chemical reactions, must be present on the label. Precautionary statements are phrases used to describe recommended measures to minimize or prevent adverse effects from exposure or improper storage and handling. These statements relate to preventing exposure, the response if exposed, storage, and disposal of a chemical. For example, these statements may include, do not breathe dust or fumes. If inhaled, remove person to fresh air, store in a well-ventilated place, dispose of contents in accordance with local regulations. Each facility's use, process, and exposure to a chemical may vary, and all precautionary statements may not apply in every situation. Pictograms are graphics which are intended to convey information relating to the hazards of a chemical. These pictograms include the circle with flames above, the flames, the exploding bomb, the test tubes pouring on metal and hands, the cylinder, skull and crossbones, the exclamation point, the chest with star emblem known as the health hazard, and aquatic toxicity. Below each pictogram is the hazards it may represent. As you can see, one pictogram may represent multiple hazards. For example, the test tube pouring on hands and metal may represent the chemicals corrosive to metal, corrosive to the skin, or corrosive to the eyes, or a combination of the three. It's important to reference the safety data sheet and other label elements to determine the specific hazards of the chemical. There were no new pictograms added in the newest update of the standard. However, there have been additions to what hazard classifications apply to the flame, exclamation mark, and gas cylinder. The flame pictogram now may also indicate that a material is a desensitized explosive. The gas cylinder now also applies to chemicals under pressure. The exclamation mark now also indicates hazards not otherwise classified. However, it is not mandatory the manufacturer include the pictogram for hazards not otherwise classified. When chemicals are sent from a manufacturer or distributor, it may be necessary to label the outer packaging or containers with the Department of Transportation pictogram placards. The transportation placards may appear with the GHS pictogram or in some cases instead of the GHS pictogram, so it is important to be aware of what these symbols represent as well. As a reminder, the standard now contains rules for small shipped containers with capacities of less than 100 milliliters or less than 3 milliliters. Oops. On this slide, you can see a sample of a shipped label with the required labeling information. The supplemental information in the bottom right-hand corner is not required. However, there is no prohibition if the manufacturer would like to include this section. When labeling containers, which are used to hold chemicals dispensed from a shipped or bulk container, there are two compliant options. The first option is to affix a label which contains all the same required information as a shipped container label. The second option is to ensure that each secondary container is labeled with the product identifier and any combination of words, pictures, or symbols which provide general information regarding the hazards of the chemical. These may include options such as signal words, pictograms, or hazard statements. Specific information must also be available to employees, which may include the safety data sheets. Where stationary containers act as a secondary container, there is additional flexibility to use signs, placards, or written materials to fulfill the labeling requirements. Regardless of the labeling system in place, employees must be trained over the site-specific labeling method, the information conveyed on the label, and how to get specific information on the hazards if needed. Below represents two secondary container label options for the same product. On the left is an example of a label which contains all 6 required elements which would appear on the shipped label. On the right is an example of a label which contains the product identifier, pictogram, signal word, and hazard statements along with the composition of the product. While both of these are viable options, employers must be sure to train employees over where the specific information on the hazards and supplier information can be found. Good secondary container labeling is crucial for safety and proper chemical handling in the workplace. Some things to consider when developing your labels are clear identification of the chemicals, including appropriate and recognizable hazard warnings, such as the pictograms, signal words, and hazard statements, and legibility and durability, such as the use of water-resistant and chemical-resistant labels, which will not wear off. Regardless of the labeling system in place, employees must be trained over the site-specific labeling method and the information conveyed on the label, and how to get the specific information if needed. Labels on shipped and secondary containers must not be removed, defaced, or illegible. Labels must also be in English at minimum. Other languages are allowed on the container as long as they do not obscure or contradict the original label. One exemption to the secondary container labeling applies only to transfer containers, which are used to transfer a chemical from a shipped container immediately to another container. This exemption only applies if the transfer is immediate and does not leave the control of the employee transferring the chemical. Additionally, for solid materials like steel beams, solid wood, or metal castings, a label must be provided with the initial shipment, but does not need to be resent unless there are changes to the label. The global harmonized system adopted by the Hazard Communication Standard is the system we've discussed in the training so far. However, other labeling and classification systems may be present in your work area. One of these is the National Fire Protection Association, NFPA 704, whose diamond may look familiar. While both of these systems are designed to help communicate information about the hazards of chemicals, they differ in their approach. The GHS system is intended to inform workers about the hazards of chemicals under normal circumstances or foreseeable emergencies. In contrast, the NFPA system is designed to inform emergency personnel of basic hazard information during a response. The GHS system uses categories generally between 1 and 4, with 1 indicating the most severe hazards. The NFPA system works opposite, categorizing hazards between 0 and 4, with 4 being the most severe. The categorization numbers are not interchangeable between these two systems. Finally, the GHS system includes information about both acute and chronic health hazards of a chemical. The NFPA labels are designed to include acute hazard information only, but do not include chronic information. If using the labeling systems other than those in GHS system, it is extremely important to ensure any people working or responsible for responding to emergencies understands any alternative labeling systems. We have a rack of chemicals stored at the facility. Take a couple seconds to see if any issues jump out to you. Be aware the longer you look, the worse it may get. The first thing we see is we have a handful of chemicals which are missing any labeling. This means employees will not be aware of hazards or precautionary information. We also have some containers which are previously used beverage containers. These are also missing any label elements. These containers are not designed to hold chemicals and should be avoided. These containers also present the possibility a chemical may be inadvertently ingested. One example includes an employee that worked in a shop area of a hotel. They picked up a water bottle from the bench and took a drink. The water bottle contained a caustic chemical instead of water. This employee sustained serious chemical burns to his mouth, throat, and esophagus, which required hospitalization. We also have at least one visible container, which has a label which is now damaged and unreadable, which may obscure hazards or other important information about the chemical. On the left-hand side, we see another example of a secondary container which is missing required information. The bottle contains the product identifier, but has no information regarding the hazards of the chemical. The photo on the right shows a shipped container which is missing the full label. Since this container was the primary container received from the manufacturer, it is required to have the full 6-element label present. It is important to routinely audit your facility to ensure that containers have appropriate labeling and that wear and tear has not damaged or removed the label. We'll now discuss safety data sheets, which are intended to provide chemical information to downstream users. Safety data sheets are the documents developed to provide specific information regarding the hazards of a chemical. Before the 2012 HazCom update, these were called material safety data sheets, which provided a less uniform system for providing chemical information. Chemicals produced and used today must have a safety data sheet which complies with the current Hazard Communication Standard. One of the benefits of the GHS system is that all safety data sheets will be in a consistent 16-section format so that the necessary information can be located in the applicable section. These 16 sections will provide information regarding the chemical's hazards, properties, and response actions. Safety data sheets must be maintained for each hazardous chemical at the facility, except for those exempted in the scope which we discussed earlier. An important note is that if a chemical is purchased from multiple employers, such as bleach or mineral spirits, an SDS from each manufacturer must be kept. Each manufacturer may formulate their products slightly different with differing compositions or hazards. Safety data sheets must be readily available to employees at all times they are in the work area, and employees must be trained on their location and how to access them. The safety data sheets can be kept in hard copy or electronic formats. However, there cannot be barriers to access, such as locks or access limited to certain people. Employers must maintain the most recent version of the safety data sheet provided by the manufacturer or distributor. Compare these two documents. On the left-hand side is an outdated material safety data sheet, and on the right is a sample current safety data sheet. The MSDS uses the HMIS classification system, which is no longer accepted by the Hazard Communication Standard, and there is no information for the supplier or responsible party. The other sections are in a different order than required, and with information that is not consistent with the new SDS requirements. If an MSDS is present for chemicals in your workplace, speak with the distributor or manufacturer about obtaining the most recent version of the safety data sheet. Below lists the required 16 sections of a safety data sheet. For a safety data sheet to be compliant, it must contain these 16 sections and in this specific order. As mentioned earlier, this allows for important information to easily be located. If you see a document which is missing or has these sections in a different order, is a good indication that the document is an outdated material safety data sheet, and an updated version should be requested from the manufacturer or distributor. MIOSHA does not have jurisdictions over sections 12 through 15. However, they are required to be present for a safety data sheet. Section 1 provides information over the identification of the chemical and the responsible party. This section will contain the product identifier, which will match the label, recommended uses, and contact information for the responsible party. The contact information can be used if there are any questions or if emergency information is required. A reminder is that with the newest update, the contact information must be from within the United States. Section 2 is the hazard identification section, which will provide information including hazards of the chemical, appropriate warning information associated with those hazards, pictograms, signal word, and precautionary statements. Section 3 provides information on the composition of the chemical. This section will provide the chemical name with the unique identifier and the concentration in the product. If an ingredient is a trade secret, the SDS will include the range that component is present. Section 4 describes the first aid measures for chemicals and the initial care after exposure. This information will include necessary first aid instructions by the relevant routes of exposure, like inhalation, skin or eye contact, or ingestion. It will also include a description of the most important symptoms or effects, and if those symptoms are acute or delayed. Sections 5 and 6 both address response actions. Section 5 provides information regarding firefighting measures. This will include suitable and unsuitable extinguishing methods, specific hazards from the chemical including combustion products, and protective equipment and precautions for firefighters. Section 6 provides information on the accidental release measures. This includes personal precautions, protective equipment, emergency procedures, and methods and materials for containment and cleaning up. An important note for these sections is that an employee shall not respond to these situations unless properly authorized, trained, and equipped, because injuries or death may occur to those not properly prepared. Section 7 addresses the handling and storage instructions for the chemicals. These include handling, proper storage conditions, and conditions to avoid. For example, you may see information like remove contaminated clothing, securely closed container, store in a cool place, avoid direct sunlight, or other instructions. Section 8 contains applicable federal OSHA permissible exposure limit and other occupational exposure limits. Specific states like Michigan may have lower permissible exposure limits that are not listed in the safety data sheet. Applicable standards should be viewed to compare these limits to. Section 8 also contains recommendations for engineering and personal protective equipment to minimize employee exposure. The recommendations may include specific materials or general recommendations in these areas. Section 9 is where you go for the physical and chemical properties of the chemical you're working with. This section will include available information on the physical state, odor and odor threshold, vapor pressure, melting point, flammability, and others. One new addition to this section is the inclusion of particulate characteristics for solid material. This will help identify if these are inhalable or respirable particulates. Section 10 discusses the stability and reactivity of the chemical. This may include if the chemical is likely to react with others and conditions to avoid. It also includes incompatible materials. For example, flammables and oxidizers should not be stored together due to the increased fire hazard, and ammonia and bleach products should not be mixed due to the creation of toxic gases. This section will also state any hazardous products which may be released as the chemical decomposes, such as carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide as it's burned, or fumes and gases generated from welding rods as they melt. Section 11 discusses any available toxicological information, including likely routes of exposure, symptoms related to chemicals, delayed and immediate effects, and information on toxicity and more. Section 12 through 15 are not under the jurisdiction of MIOSHA since they address ecological and transportation concerns. We will quickly discuss them so you're aware of these sections though. Section 12 includes information on hazards to the ecosystem if the chemical were to be released. Section 13 discusses proper disposal and safe handling of wastes. Section 14 provides transportation information for shipping of the material. And Section 15 provides other applicable regulations, such as the Toxic Substance Control Act, California's Proposition 65, or others. Section 16 provides the date of preparation of the safety data sheet, or the last revision date. The section may also include NFPA information, disclaimers, or other information the manufacturer feels necessary. However, this is not required. Safety data sheets may be maintained electronically provided the following conditions are met. First, like hard copy safety data sheets, employees must have adequate access without barriers. Barriers may include computer terminals that are not always accessible, requirement of password that's not readily provided, or other restrictions which limit employee access. If using electronic means for your safety data sheet, there also must be a backup procedure in place in case there is a power outage, network interruption, or other internet access issue. These backup procedures may include paper copies, a secondary electronic system, or phone access where SDS can be requested immediately. Employees must be trained on the primary and backup system for SDS access, and there must be a procedure for transmitting hard copies when requested or in the case of emergency. An important note about electronic access is that simply providing internet access so employees can search for an SDS on the web is not considered adequate for maintaining safety data sheets. For those employees who work at mobile, temporary, or remote work sites, the safety data sheets may be kept at a primary central location, such as the main office or warehouse. If safety data sheets are kept at a central location, employees must still have ready access to the safety data sheets and information. This can be accomplished by having a representative available to handle calls and requests at the central location or through electronic or technological means. Employees working in areas with unreliable communication and internet access may need alternative means to access a safety data sheet. The written program must address how safety data sheet information will be provided to those employees working in the field. Below are the two MIOSHA posters related to safety data sheets, which must be present in your workplace where employees can view them. The left poster notifies employees of the location of the safety data sheet, the backup locations if applicable, who's responsible for the safety data sheets, and how they can be contacted. The poster on the right is for when a new or revised safety data sheet is received from the supplier or manufacturer. The information includes what safety data sheet was received, when it was received, when the poster was updated, and where the new safety data sheet can be found. This poster must be filled out within 5 working days of when a new safety data sheet is received and must remain posted for a minimum of 10 working days. Be aware, manufacturers may be updating safety data sheets if the chemicals they apply to were affected by the change of the standard we discussed earlier. Training and information regarding the hazards and chemical and program elements is paramount for employee safety. This rule is also one of the top 10 most cited rules by MIOSHA. Effective training will provide employees with an understanding of the GHS system, hazards in their workplace, how they can protect themselves, and the site-specific information on the hazard communication program. Employees must be provided with effective hazard communication training over the program. This training must be provided at least at the time of initial assignment and whenever new hazards or information are introduced. This training must be understandable to employees and at a language and literacy level employees comprehend. This training may be designed to cover categories of chemicals or specific chemicals in the work area, but it must be facility specific. Employees must be provided with the following information: the requirements of the Hazard Communication Standard, operations in their work area where chemical hazards are present, and the location and availability of the written program, list of chemicals, and applicable safety data sheets. The training for employees over the hazard chemicals they use must include the following. It must address the methods to detect presence or release of hazardous chemicals. This may include monitoring data or devices such as oxygen or carbon monoxide sensors, visual or odor properties, or other means used at the facility. Training must address the specific hazards associated with the chemicals in an employee's work area. This may be accomplished through addressing each chemical specifically or through categories of chemicals present. Training shall also provide information on the measures in place to protect employees. This may include engineering or administrative controls, emergency procedures, or personal protective equipment. Lastly, the details of the site's hazard communication program must be provided to employees. This includes the explanation of shipped label elements and requirements, the workplace labeling elements, what information is available in the safety data sheet, the order of the information, and how to use that information. The training and information provided to employees must be site-specific regarding the hazards, warning properties, protective measures, and program details. Manufacturers may withhold certain information about a chemical on the safety data sheet if it is claimed to be a trade secret. This does not mean employers and medical professionals are not entitled to this information in certain instances. If a healthcare provider determines a medical emergency exists and specific chemical information is needed, that information shall be immediately disclosed to the provider. The manufacturer may require a signed confidentiality agreement after the emergency, though. Chemical-specific information may still be requested on non-emergency situations by employers, health and safety professionals, or healthcare providers if a reasonable need exists. The request must be in writing and explain why the information is necessary and how it meets one or more of the occupational health and safety reasons provided in the standard. These reasons include the need to assess hazards of the chemical, the need to perform IH sampling, conducting medical surveillance, providing medical treatment, selecting or assessing appropriate personal protective equipment, engineering, or other workplace controls, and the need to conduct studies to determine health effects of exposure. The requester may have to sign a confidentiality agreement that the information will not be used outside of the health and safety reasons described in the request. MIOSHA has developed a web page dedicated to the resources available for the hazard communication and GHS information. After today, this recorded webinar will be available to view and linked on this page. Additionally, MIOSHA has developed 4 modules to assist in training your employees. These modules cover an overview of the Hazard Communication Standard, the GHS classification system, labeling requirements, and the information included in safety data sheets. These modules are available in pre-recorded format with narration similar to this webinar, or in PowerPoint form for employers to incorporate into their training programs. While these modules will help address some of the required training topics, employers will still need to supplement their site-specific information, including where hazardous chemicals are used, the hazards of those chemicals, effective means of detection and protection, the labeling system implemented, and the location and access of safety data sheets and the written hazard communication program. The MIOSHA Hazard Communication GHS webpage also contains links to other helpful documents for your overall program development. We have a written compliance guide, which has the standards and requirements laid out, an index of terms, a sample SDS quiz, and suggestions for pipe labeling and chemical indexing. Also available is a sample written hazard communication program and the required safety data sheet posters. Federal OSHA has also developed publications such as the Steps to an Effective Hazardous Communication Program and Small Entity Compliance Guide for employers that use hazardous chemicals. Federal OSHA also has a dedicated hazard communication webpage. The right-hand picture shows the available resources on the webpage at this time. MIOSHA's Consultation, Education, and Training Division also offers a variety of free services to assist in developing your health and safety program. These services include on-site or virtual consultations and training sessions, and in-person hazard surveys to help assess compliance with MIOSHA standards and hazards in the workplace. MIOSHA can also provide free industrial hygiene sampling for a variety of chemical and physical hazards. MIOSHA also offers access to free workplace safety and health video streaming services. The MIOSHA Training Institute is a program that provides affordable occupational safety and health training to employers across the state. These seminars help provide employers and employees with important knowledge of hazards, controls, and applicable safety and health rules. MIOSHA's website contains further information regarding CET services, cooperative and grant programs like the MyWish program, and available MTI courses. Today we have discussed the purpose and scope of MIOSHA's Part 42, 92, and 430 Hazard Communication Standard with an overview of the 2025 updates. We've outlined the required elements of the Written Hazard Communication Program, labeling requirements, and information in the safety data sheets. Lastly, we provided some publicly available resources available through MIOSHA. We will also have a link to our QR code to request CET services and contact information for any remaining questions. If you have additional questions, please feel free to submit a request for consultative services or reach out via phone to our CET main line at 517-284-7720. If you have questions or would like to request further consultative, training, or hazard survey services, please complete a request for consultative assistance available through either the link or QR code provided. We'll wait a second so everyone can scan those. Thank you again for attending today's webinar regarding MIOSHA's Hazard Communication Standard. We hope the information provided will assist you in creating a safe and healthy workplace.